Hi there everyone, welcome to our first video for Module 2, where we'll be discussing a lot of sexuality studies, and in particular the foundations of an approach that is generally called queer theory. We're going to begin in this first half of the module with videos on Sigmund Freud and Michel Foucault talking a little bit about the nature of sexuality. The reason why we're doing these readings is because many of the methods pioneered in women, gender, sexuality studies that are applied especially to that last part, sexuality studies, are derived in one way or another from the, general theoretical apparatus or something like that, the thought of these two figures, Sigmund Freud and Michel Foucault. So that's what we're going to be discussing in this video. In particular, we're going to talk about Sigmund Freud and psychoanalysis. Now, you might have impressions of this guy, Sigmund Freud, either from another class or from some sort of cultural thing. He's the sort of guy where he was famous enough that he was parodied in Looney Tunes, all of this sort of thing, right? So you probably have some impression of Sigmund Freud, and if you've been in an introductory psychology class, for example, you probably learned something about Freud. Our goal is not necessarily understanding Freud as such, right? We're not trying to be psychologists or psychoanalysts or something like that, right? So we're not really going to focus on the clinical side of Freud's work, and there are really significant questions about Freud's methodology and his usefulness for the development of clinical science. But what we're going to stick to are particularly Freud's insights as it pertains to gender, sex, and sexuality. There have been a great many number of feminist thinkers and scholars who have drawn on Sigmund Freud's thought in one way or another to develop their own distinctly, feminist or queer critique of society. So we're learning, some stuff about Sigmund Freud, and it might seem like you've wandered into a philosophy or psychology class somewhere. But we're using this all as a means to an end, which is to understand our own field, the field that we're studying in this class, women, gender, and sexuality studies. So with that being said, let's talk about Freud. If you have all sorts of different impressions of Freud, as I might have mentioned, what we're going to do now is kind of shake up those preconceptions about Freud and his work. The reason why Freud is interesting to feminists and scholars of sexuality studies is because Freud was, in many respects, the discoverer of the unconscious, which are, you could say, thoughts, beliefs, and desires that do not appear to conscious awareness. And so Freud had this thought that I think most of us can relate to in one way or another, a thought which is more or less accepted by contemporary neuroscience, psychology, which is that a great many number of the thoughts that we have don't reach the threshold of conscious awareness. We're perceiving things around us all the time, and we are active perceivers, which means that we're focusing on some things and not on other things. And so attention only, is maybe a spotlight or something in one domain of our psychical lives. So, but for every moment that we are aware of something, there's a multitude of other things that we sense or perceive of which we are not fully aware, right? Of which our awareness is not directed. So, for example, you perceive but are probably not paying attention to, this little bit of, art that I have on the wall over here that is like mostly covered up anyway, right? This was something that you previously were perceiving, but you were not, paying attention to in any way. The unconscious is really just one step below that there are not only things of which, we could be consciously aware, like I can fixate my attention on that artwork or whatever, right? But also, further, there are things of which we choose, in a certain sense, not to be aware of. In other words, we repress, we censor these ideas. We don't accept them. They're too painful, in certain circumstances for us to entertain. And so we, shove them to the background of our conscious awareness. And this is the dimension of our lives, our psychical lives, that Freud called the unconscious. Now, there are actually a whole bunch of thinkers who talked about this aspect of our psychical or mental lives before Freud. But what's interesting and what's unique about Freud is that Freud gave us a means or a mechanism for discovering the nature of our unconscious. And this method is what Freud called psychoanalysis. So, if you're like me and you watch old-timey cartoons, something like that, you might have had the impression of therapy where it's like you walk into some office and there's a couch, right? The couch is facing like upwards, right? And your doctor, therapist, or whatever, right, is like sitting down on the other side of the room, like jotting stuff on their notepad, right? If this is your impression of what therapy is like, you'll find that contemporary therapy is not really like that at all. That's not really how it works now. But in what those old-timey cartoons and so on are parodying is the real clinical practice of psychoanalysis that existed in the 20th century, basically until United States health insurance stopped covering it. So if you study psychology, then this is known as sort of the paradigm shift to cognitive behavioral therapy. So now the way that we do therapy is totally different. But back then, the way that therapy would work is you would have a patient come in and the patient would talk. They would just explain all the stuff that was going on in their life, right? And the psychoanalyst was meant to be somebody who listened to what the patient was saying, and more than just listen to them, interpret what they were saying, right? To try to unearth or describe or understand the unconscious psychic mechanisms at work in the patient. Not for the purposes of just like diagnosing them, like, hey, you're neurotic or something like that, right? But instead, for the purposes of helping them work through these kinds of unconscious processes. So psychoanalysis was really called the talking cure, right? And why was it the talking cure? Well, because the way that psychoanalysis would work is you would lay on the couch and you would talk, and you're supposed to free associate. So you're supposed to say the first thing that comes to your mind and not censor yourself in any way at all. And the idea is that, if the analyst can just follow your unconscious associations, then they can discover the unconscious mechanism guiding your thought in these cases, right? And importantly, Freud was very interesting because he was like one of these people that was educated in everything, right? So Freud didn't just see psychoanalysis as a method pertaining just to this clinical context. Freud actually used psychoanalysis to interpret his own dreams. For example, he uses psychoanalysis to interpret literature. And in fact, sort of like the main place where psychoanalysis is still practiced as a method is mostly in like literature departments in order to read classical works of literature. And so what's going on here is there's a sort of a three-part structure, which I think is common to basically every version of psychoanalysis. It involves maintaining that there's something called a manifest text, right? Text just being any, it can be verbal too, right? Like any material that you're reading, that you're analyzing. And manifest is like what's on the surface, right? So the manifest text is the dimension of speech in which the patient is consciously aware. So this is oftentimes how the patient views themselves. So in the case where you're doing psychoanalysis, right, and you're like, say I'm a patient, I'm blabbing on the couch, right, then just what I'm saying, right, that is the manifest text, right? I say something like, I had a dream about barbecuing or something like that, right? And the manifest text would just be how I understood the dream, namely as about barbecuing. Okay, next level, right? So in contrast to the manifest text, you have the latent text. So this refers to the true unconscious meaning of the patient's speech, thoughts, and desires, right? So like me, I described having this dream about barbecuing or whatever, but you, my analyst, you know that I'm thinking about my neighbor and I'm thinking about this conflict I had with my neighbor, and I'm trying to act like, oh, if we could just throw this party or whatever, I make you barbecue, everything will be okay, right? And so I don't really see that, you know, my dream isn't just about barbecuing or whatever, right? It's about fulfilling this wish to make amends with this other person, blah, 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 blah. Right? It doesn't really matter that you find like that particular example very plausible, right? But I hope you can see the point, right? The point is just that when you go through that process of interpreting the real meaning of a dream or the real meaning of what the patient is saying about themselves and so on, right? Then you're analyzing what you take to be the latent text, right? It's in the manifest text, right? But you need some way to read between the lines to get beneath the mere surface, right? And how do you do that? Well, the main concept that Freud has here is repression, which we could just define as the means by which the manifest text differs from the latent text. So like in our silly example with me and barbecuing, right? Why is there a difference between the latent and the manifest text? Well, because I'm like, in that case, repressing my desire or something like that to make up with my neighbor, right? This sort of thing is what Freud has in mind. Now, of course, I'm not going to tell you go see a psychoanalyst or, you know, we're going to start doing this or something like that, right? As I said, that's not the purpose for why we're doing this. We're interested in this as kind of a method, right? A method for diagnosing, understanding what's wrong. Freud used this method to diagnose and understand and analyze, right, patients in a clinical context. Now, feminists and queer theorists and trans studies theorists, right, it's very interesting because they will use this exact same framework to analyze, to diagnose, to understand society. And just as in the individual person, there is sort of, a manifest way that it appears to them, but then there's the truth of the matter, and there's the repression of that truth. So too, at the social level, right, there are sort of the ideological stories that we tell ourselves about gender and sexuality. There's a truth about gender and sexuality. And there's a story about how the truth of gender and sexuality becomes repressed by the kind of society that we live in. Now, so what is, in a certain sense, the manifest text, right? What are dogmas about sexuality that Freud wants to analyze away? And Freud brings up three dogmas of sexuality in the essay that we read together, the Sexual Aberrations essay. The first is that libido is absent in childhood and develops only in puberty and adolescence. The second is that normal, healthy, you could also say, sexuality is defined by heterosexual object choice. We'll explain that terminology in a second. And third, the aim of sexuality is heterosexual genital copulation for the purposes of biological reproduction. Now, we're not going to talk about the first of these dogmas. That's just an entirely different discussion, right? What we're going to talk about, what's relevant to women, gender, sexuality studies, are in particular the second and the third dogmas, right? Why are these important? Because these introduce some important terminology, namely sexual object choice and sexual aim. I've written these down over here. So Freud thinks, he discusses this at the very beginning of the article that we read, that we have something, call it hunger, which is sort of like natural desire to eat food, right? To gain nutrients, something like that. And when we feel this desire, we call that hunger. And hunger is satiated by food, right? By the thing that can satisfy the aim of hunger, which is to give you the appropriate nutrients and so on. So with hunger, there's a relatively fixed object and aim, right? Hunger points at food, and hunger aims at satiating hunger, being filled, eating, right? These are very basic ideas. So by analogy, there is the human desire, need for sexuality, right? Just as an analog to the desire for food. And just as we call it the desire for food, hunger, let's call it the desire for sex, libido. Okay? Freud's point that he's trying to make, at least part of his point that he's trying to make, is that one disanalogy between libido and hunger is that unlike hunger and libido, we have an unusually wide variation in sexual objects and a wide variety of sexual aims. What does that mean? Well, it means that the sorts of persons that people want to be with, right? People that you see as a desirable sexual partner is wide, right? That is the sexual object. And the sexual aim is what you want to do sexually with that other person. So these dogmas are in a certain way saying, okay, normal, healthy sexuality is where your sexual object is, an adult, woman if you're a man, man if you're a woman, right? It's defined by heterosexuality. So, if you're an adult man, then your appropriate healthy sexual objects are, adult women, right? So heterosexuality is just baked into clinically how sexologists and early sexual scientists, a lot of these people were associated with eugenics, right? Ugly stuff. They thought that normal sexuality is just being heterosexual, right? The partner that you want should be, part of a heterosexual coupling. And Freud talks about this myth, this dogma, right, in terms of a fable. We imagine that like men and women are like two halves of a single whole. And you see this terminology, this image, this idea, right? That men and women complement one another, they belong together, they, synergize, that would be a kind of stupid corporate way of putting it, right, with one another, right? But that is sort of the prevailing view, at least according to, these old sexologists and people that Freud is trying to criticize. So, we take it maybe in culture broadly, less and less so now, right? That having a healthy sexuality means choosing the appropriate heterosexual partner, right? Okay, so that's one part of having healthy sexuality, according to this view. Second part is that the aim or the purpose of sexuality is heterosexual genital copulation for the purposes of biological reproduction. So in other words, the reason why men and women are two halves of one whole, right, the reason why they complement one another, right, is precisely because you need a man and a woman to produce a child, right, to engage in biological reproduction. Biological reproduction is seen as the central aim and goal of sexuality, right? And therefore, all of sexuality aims at this. Freud's argument is that this is manifestly false as a description of the sexual lives of his patients, and we can see that even more today. Right? So, part of what Freud points to demonstrate that normal sexuality is not defined by heterosexual object choice is he points to a case of what he calls inverts or inversion. These were people that were said to have inverted sexual object choice. So now we would just say that makes you gay. Right? So you're a woman, and instead of liking men, you like women, right? You're a man, instead of liking women, you like men. This is how Freud understood what inversion was. And the prevailing attitude of the times beyond Freud was that this was a kind of mental illness. This is a kind of sickness. It's indicative of kind of pathological neurosis. It means something's wrong with you. It means the doctors should, basically determine the full nature of your life choices, and that you're, they have the appropriate authority to regulate your behavior as a mentally ill person. Freud says against this view, okay, there's actually a huge variety of inverts, right? You could say that with quotation marks, right? Now we would just say gay people. There's an enormous variety of gay people. And moreover, not all, or even most, or many of these gay people are pathological. None are pathological simply in virtue of being gay, right? And so part of Freud's point is just to say that, look, the things that we're attracted to are not necessarily bound by heterosexuality. And moreover, that the fact that you move beyond the purview of heterosexuality is not indicative that you're sick or that something's wrong with you or that, you need help and you need to become a ward of the state or anything like that, right? And moreover, the people that believe the second dogma, right, about heterosexual object choice, believe it precisely because of the third dogma, which is about the aim of sexuality. But even if you're not gay or anything like that, right, you've never had a desire outside of the confines of heterosexuality in your life, okay, fine. Even take that. This model does not account for your view, your understanding of sexuality. Why not? Well, because even the straightest people that you know do not exclusively engage in heterosexual genital copulation. Most people, when they have sex, are not exclusively having sex in order to reproduce. People don't have sex with just anybody that can reproduce. People that also can't reproduce, either because of old age or infertility or anything else, even in heterosexuality, right? They also have sex. And so, we don't view these cases of sexuality as pathological. We don't view it as pathological when, teenagers have sex and they have a child and it's by accident, right? It wasn't the aim, end, or goal of, their sexual behavior. But that's not indicative of a kind of pathology. The truth is, just as Anne Fausto Sterling taught us that the variety of biological sex was simply greater than the dogmas that we're told about sex, right? That sex has to be binary, that it has to be men or women, right? And it's all just one factor, your chromosomes or whatever. We learned that it was way more complicated than that. So too, Freud's whole point is that there's not anything like normal object choice. There's not just a normal thing that everybody who is normal or healthy or has a normal healthy sexuality desires in their partner. It's an enormous variety of that. And moreover, people do not aim at the same things, right? People do not necessarily aim at genital copulation. They don't aim at biological reproduction. And sexuality is simply, as a fact, more expansive than these categories are allowing for. And so part of Freud's main point, what he wants to say about sexuality as a whole, is that we've had the tendency to understand sexuality as if it were an animalistic instinct, as if it were something that just can't change. It has one thing it aims at and one thing it's satisfied by, and that's it, right? Hunger, for example, is an instinct. And part of the reason why it's an instinct is because the only object of hunger is food, and the only aim of hunger, ultimately, is to satisfy nutritional deficiencies. And so Freud's point is that in contrast to hunger, which appears very, very uniform in its nature, despite the wide variety of foods that we eat, sexuality differs and is better described not as an instinct, but as a drive. In other words, the object choice of sexuality is something fluid and changes. And moreover, the end, aim, or goal of sexuality is also something fluid and changes. Freud thought, and this was one aspect of the reading that we've not discussed up to this point, that everyone was what we would now call intersexual, but Freud called constitutional bisexuality. So like we tend to use the word bisexuality to refer to someone that like could either be gay or straight, right? But Freud talks about bisexuality as in having two sexes, namely aspects of both male and female sexes. And so Freud thought that all of us have characteristics of both, right? And this was sort of a way for him to appreciate the kinds of points that Anne Fausto Sterling made. So Freud in Psychoanalysis attempts to shine a light on the aspects of sexuality that we tend to overlook or forget. And why do we tend to overlook and forget these aspects about sexuality? Well, because they're very heavily regulated, right? I mean, just in the same way that Freud describes how a patient represses the things that they don't want to know or understand, so the state represses forms of life that it deems to be abnormal or unhealthy. You know, if you just look at old laws in the United States, but also all throughout Europe, about sodomy laws, about cross-dressing, and so on, right? Essentially, what goes on in sexuality is that sexuality is regulated to aim at the reproduction of heterosexuality. It's aimed at, producing lineage, property, family, and so on, right? But the truth is that, of course, the fact that we need to regulate sexuality points at how sexuality always overcomes and expands and is greater than the repressive restrictions that are laid upon it, right? So in other words, the latent text, the truth of the manifest text, has to do with the fluidity, the changeability, the variability, the variation of human sexuality. We're going to end things there because that was already quite a lot of content, and I will see you in the next video. Bye.